The harsh, strobing flash of red and blue police lights was reflecting off the pristine, eggshell-white paint of my garage door, illuminating the driveway in a chaotic disco of law enforcement. I stood dead center on the perfectly manicured concrete, the low hum of my gas-powered weed whacker still vibrating through my hands. I was staring at two very confused, very silent local police officers. They were staring back at me. And really, I couldn't blame them for the absolute, utter bewilderment plastered across their faces. After all, I was standing in front of my house on a Tuesday afternoon, wearing a skin-tight, blindingly neon yellow spandex morphsuit that covered every single inch of my body, including my face, leaving absolutely nothing to the imagination. I looked like a giant, aggressively glowing highlighter that had somehow gained sentience and decided to do some landscaping. One of the cops slowly lowered his hand from his utility belt, rubbed his temples, and let out a sigh so deep I could hear it over the idling engine of his cruiser. How did I get here? How did a grown man end up dressed like a radioactive ninja in the middle of the most aggressively sanitized suburb in America? To understand the sheer, unadulterated absurdity of this standoff, we have to rewind exactly 2 weeks. I live in Celebration, Florida. If you've never heard of it, just picture a town where every single blade of grass is legally required to be exactly 2.5 inches high. The houses are painted in colors approved by a shadowy council of retirees, and the overall vibe is somewhere between a Norman Rockwell painting and a dystopian psychological thriller. I moved here because it's quiet. I spend my entire week running point on massive digital video productions, managing multi-project timelines, and coordinating offboarding processes for high-maintenance corporate clients. By the time Saturday morning rolls around, my brain is completely fried from balancing budgets and chasing down missing video assets. All I want to do is drink my coffee, put in my earbuds, and mow my lawn in absolute, uninterrupted peace. I am not a troublemaker. I am a guy who likes his spreadsheets organized and his weekends boring. But peace is a foreign concept to Brenda. Brenda is the president of the Architectural Review Committee for our Homeowners Association. If you look up the word petty in the dictionary, there is a picture of Brenda holding a clipboard and frowning at a slightly crooked mailbox. She is a woman whose entire existence revolves around enforcing the community guidelines with the kind of military precision usually reserved for nuclear submarine commanders. She wears sensible beige slacks, pastel cardigans, and a perpetually sour expression that suggests she just smelled something rotting in your garbage can. We had managed to avoid each other for the better part of a year, mostly because I made sure my property was flawlessly maintained. But in Celebration, flying under the radar only works for so long. It was a beautiful, humid Saturday morning. The sun was shining, the birds were aggressively chirping, and I stepped out of my front door ready to tackle the yard work. I was wearing a pair of beat-up khaki cargo shorts and a salmon-colored polo shirt. It wasn't neon. It wasn't glowing. It was just a slightly bright, cheerful pinkish-orange shirt that I got on clearance at a sporting goods store. I fired up the mower and got to work, lost in a podcast about combat sports analysis, completely oblivious to the danger lurking next door. I was halfway through the front lawn when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I jumped, killed the engine on the mower, and yanked out one of my earbuds. There she was. Brenda was leaning over the white picket fence that separated our properties. Her lips pursed so tightly they had practically disappeared into her face. She was squinting at me from behind a pair of oversized tortoiseshell sunglasses. "Can I help you, Brenda?" I asked, wiping a bead of sweat from my forehead. "I certainly hope so," she said, her voice dripping with that specific brand of fake Southern sweetness that actually means she wants to destroy you. Because that shirt you're wearing is visually aggressive. I blinked. I looked down at my chest. I looked back up at her. Visually aggressive. Brenda, it's a polo shirt. It's salmon. It is distracting, she countered, pulling a small, leather-bound notebook out of her pocket. It completely clashes with the historical aesthetic of the neighborhood. We maintain a certain standard of muted, elegant colors here in Celebration. That garment is a nuisance. I actually laughed out loud. I couldn't help it. Are you serious right now? You're policing my clothes? I'm in my own yard mowing my own grass. Do I need to submit a permit to wear cotton? Her eyes narrowed. The fake sweetness instantly evaporated. Section 4, paragraph 12 of the community bylaws clearly states that residents must not create a visual nuisance that disrupts the harmony of the neighborhood. I am giving you a verbal warning. Go inside and change into something appropriate, or I will be forced to issue a formal citation. I stared at her for a long, quiet moment. I thought about the 60-hour work week I just had. I thought about the endless client emails, the budget recalculations, the sheer mental exhaustion of managing other people's chaos. And then I looked at this woman, standing in the Florida heat, genuinely threatening me over a pink shirt. Something inside me just clicked. The part of my brain that usually compromised and smoothed things over went completely dark, replaced by a cold, calculating desire for absolute, malicious compliance. Brenda, I said, my voice dangerously calm. I am going to finish mowing my lawn. If my shirt is hurting your eyes, I suggest you go inside and close your blinds. Have a perfectly average day. I shoved my earbud back in, ripped the starter cord on the mower, and turned my back on her. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see her furiously scribbling in her little notebook before storming back into her house. The war had officially begun, and I was entirely here for it. 3 days later, I checked my mailbox. Tucked between a coupon flyer and a water bill was a crisp white envelope with the HOA logo stamped in the corner. Certified mail. I ripped it open standing right there on the sidewalk. It was an official notice of violation. Brenda had actually done it. She cited me under the Community Harmony and Visual Nuisance Clause. Attached to the bottom of the letter was a pink slip demanding a fine of exactly $50, payable to the HOA within 14 days. I stood there, holding the piece of paper, and a slow, wide grin spread across my face. She wanted to play the administrative game? Fine. I manage complex project life cycles for a living. Bureaucratic warfare is my love language. The very next morning, I drove to the bank. I walked up to the teller and requested $50 in pennies. Unrolled. The teller looked at me like I was insane. But 10 minutes later, I walked out with a heavy canvas sack clinking with copper. I drove straight to the HOA management office, walked up to the front desk, and dumped the bag out. 5,000 loose pennies cascaded across the receptionist's desk like a copper waterfall. Payment for citation number 4409, I said cheerfully, sliding the pink slip across the desk. I'd like a receipt once you've verified the count, please. But paying the fine in the most annoying way legally possible was only step one. If Brenda thought a $50 penalty was going to make me conform to her beige-washed worldview, she grossly miscalculated. The following Saturday, the sun was beating down, the humidity was at a solid 90%, and it was time to edge the driveway. I opened my closet and bypassed the salmon polo entirely. Instead, I pulled out a tank top. Not just any tank top. It was a synthetic, moisture-wicking athletic shirt in a shade of neon construction worker orange that was so vibrant it almost hurt to look directly at it. It was the kind of shirt they make highway workers wear so they don't get hit by semi-trucks in the dead of night. I paired it with my shortest pair of athletic shorts, slipped on my protective safety glasses, grabbed my weed whacker, and marched out the front door. I made sure to take my time. I edged the concrete with the meticulous, slow precision of a brain surgeon. I walked back and forth along the property line, letting the glorious Florida sun bounce off my high-visibility torso. It only took 20 minutes. I saw her front curtains twitch. I saw the blinds part. I kept my head down, revving the two-stroke engine, waiting for the inevitable. 10 minutes later, a white Ford Explorer with the local police department's logo slowly rolled down the street. It came to a creeping halt right in front of my driveway. The window rolled down, and a young cop with a thick mustache and a look of profound exhaustion peered out at me. I killed the weed whacker and walked over to the street, smiling politely. "Morning, officer. Can I help you?" I asked. The cop put the cruiser in park and stepped out, resting his hand casually on his duty belt. He looked me up and down, squinting slightly against the glare of my orange shirt. His name tag read, Ramirez. "Hey there," Officer Ramirez said, letting out a heavy sigh. "Look, man, I got a call on the non-emergency dispatch about a, quote, disturbing and aggressive individual pacing the neighborhood causing a public distress. Unquote. I looked around the empty, perfectly quiet street. I looked back at Ramirez. "Does it look like I'm causing a public distress, officer?" Ramirez rubbed the back of his neck. "It looks like you're doing your edging. The caller, your neighbor, Brenda, she was pretty frantic, said you were intentionally trying to provoke a hostile environment." "I'm wearing a bright shirt, Officer Ramirez. That's it. My HOA president has decided that she doesn't like my landscaping wardrobe. I got fined $50 last week for wearing pink. This week I decided to go with orange. Is it a misdemeanor to be tacky in this county?" Ramirez closed his eyes for a full 3 seconds, as if praying to whatever deity protects municipal workers from suburban drama. When he opened them, he just shook his head. "Listen to me very carefully," Ramirez said, his voice completely flat. "I am 2 hours away from the end of my shift. I have real crimes to deal with. I have traffic stops to make. I do not care if you mow your lawn in a tuxedo, a clown suit, or a neon orange tank top. Being brightly colored is not against the law. It is not a police matter. So I'm free to go back to my yard work?" "Please," Ramirez said, already turning back to his cruiser. "Just finish your lawn. And tell Brenda if she calls 911 again because she doesn't like somebody's outfit, I'm going to write her a citation for misuse of emergency services. Have a good weekend, sir." "You too, officer," I called out cheerfully as he drove away. I turned around and looked directly at Brenda's living room window. I knew she was standing right there. I raised my hand and gave her a massive, enthusiastic wave, making sure my neon orange torso was fully visible. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought having the police practically laugh in her face would force Brenda to retreat, lick her wounds, and find some other poor neighbor to terrorize about leaving their trash cans out 3 minutes past the designated retrieval time. But I underestimated the sheer, unrelenting stubbornness of a bored HOA president with an ego injury. Brenda didn't retreat. She escalated. 2 days later, an email hit the inbox of every resident in Celebration. The subject line read, "Urgent Emergency Architectural Review Committee Meeting. Bylaw Amendment." I didn't even have to open it to know what it was about, but I read it anyway. Brenda had called an emergency vote. She had drafted a brand new, hyper-specific addendum to the community guidelines. It passed unanimously, mostly because the rest of the board was terrified of her. The new rule was blasted out to the neighborhood. Effective immediately, all residents performing exterior property maintenance must wear subdued, earth-toned, appropriate landscaping attire while in view of the street to prevent visual distraction and maintain the historical integrity of the community. I sat at my kitchen table, sipping my coffee, reading the PDF attachment on my laptop. Subdued, earth-toned, appropriate attire. She thought she had me cornered. She thought she had used her little bureaucratic hammer to smash my rebellion into the beige pavement. I smiled. This is where being a meticulous project manager pays off. When you spend your life reading through ironclad client contracts looking for scope creep, you learn how to spot a loophole from a mile away. I read the new rule again. I read it forwards. I read it backwards. I pulled up the municipal codes for the city. I cross-referenced the HOA master deed. And there it was, the glorious, gaping hole in her impenetrable armor. The HOA had mandated appropriate attire, but they hadn't explicitly defined what constituted a piece of clothing versus, say, a full-body apparatus. Furthermore, they demanded earth-toned, but they had no jurisdiction over safety equipment if the work required it. I opened a new tab on my browser and navigated to Amazon Prime. I typed a very specific query into the search bar, bypassed the standard apparel section, and went straight into the novelty and theatrical gear. I found exactly what I was looking for: a full-body, skin-tight, premium spandex morphsuit. It covered the feet, the hands, the torso, the neck, and the entire head. You could see through the fabric, but nobody could see your face. And the color? It wasn't salmon. It wasn't orange. It was radioactive high-vis yellow. It was the exact opposite of earth-toned. It was the kind of yellow that burns itself into your retinas. I clicked Buy Now, paid for overnight shipping, and waited. When the package arrived on Friday afternoon, it felt like holding Excalibur. I ripped open the plastic and held the suit up to the light. It was magnificent. The following morning, I didn't just get dressed, I suited up for battle. Slipping into a full-body morphsuit is a bizarre sensory experience. It clings to every curve, compressing you into a featureless aerodynamic silhouette. Surprisingly, the spandex breathed incredibly well, making it oddly comfortable in the Florida heat. I zipped the back all the way up over my head. I looked in the hall mirror. I looked like a massive, aggressive banana. I was a faceless, glowing entity of pure, unadulterated lawn care vengeance. I grabbed my keys, walked out the front door, and marched straight to the garage. I didn't grab the weed whacker this time. I wanted to make an entrance. I wanted a parade. I fired up my John Deere riding mower. The engine roared to life, echoing down the pristine, quiet street. I pulled out of the garage, the blinding yellow spandex practically glowing in the morning sun, and began my descent down the front lawn. The reaction was instantaneous. I was moving at roughly 3 miles an hour, but the impact was seismic. Out of the mesh face shield, I watched the neighborhood completely short-circuit. A guy walking his golden retriever stopped dead in his tracks, his jaw dropping so far I thought it might unhinge. A minivan driving down the street slammed on its brakes, lingering in front of my house as the kids in the back seat mashed their faces against the glass. A jogger, completely distracted by the glowing yellow alien cruising on a riding mower, actually tripped over the curb and tumbled onto the grass. I just sat perfectly upright, my hands resting on the steering wheel, maintaining a slow, methodical pace across the grass. I looked like a glitch in the Matrix. I looked like a walking, driving middle finger. And then I heard the scream. It was muffled over the sound of the John Deere engine, but it was shrill, panicked, and filled with absolute rage. I turned my faceless yellow head toward the property line. Brenda had burst out of her front door. She was wearing a floral bathrobe, clutching a coffee mug in one hand and her phone in the other. Her face was turning a shade of purple that I had never seen on a human being before. She was waving her arms wildly, screaming at the top of her lungs, pointing at me, pointing at the grass, pointing at the sky. I couldn't hear a single word she was saying, but the body language was poetry. I didn't stop the mower. I didn't turn off the engine. I just lifted one neon yellow spandex-clad hand and gave her a slow, exaggerated, enthusiastic wave. Brenda threw her coffee mug onto her own lawn, turned around, and practically kicked her front door open as she ran back inside. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was calling the police again. She was calling the HOA board. She was probably trying to call the National Guard. Let her call them. I had read the bylaws. I was not wearing a shirt. I was not wearing pants. I was encapsulated in a single unified fabric structure. By the time Monday rolled around, the HOA had slipped a letter under my door. They didn't even use the mail this time. It was hand-delivered with malicious intent. The letter was printed on heavy stock paper, demanding an immediate cessation of wearing novelty theatrical costumes during property maintenance. The fine had been escalated from $50 to a staggering $500 per day, and the letter ended with a thinly veiled threat to place a lien on my house if I didn't comply. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought they had finally outmaneuvered me with legalese and financial threats. What they didn't know was that I had been planning a massive home improvement project for months. My driveway apron, the flared section of concrete that connects my private driveway to the public street, had been cracking and sinking for years. I had been meaning to get it replaced, but I had put it off because dealing with contractors and permits was a headache. But sitting there, holding Brenda's $500 threat in my hand, the pieces of a beautifully destructive puzzle fell perfectly into place. I didn't need to fight the HOA on their turf. I needed to move the battlefield. I needed to bring in the federal government. I picked up my phone and called a local concrete contractor I had found online. The guy who answered sounded like he chewed gravel for breakfast. "Big Mike's Concrete and Paving, this is Mike." A thick, booming Boston accent roared through the receiver. "Hey, Mike," I said, leaning back in my chair. "I need an apron replacement, but I need it done this week, and I need to pull the permits for a right-of-way improvement. Are you available?" "Right-of-way permits take a couple of days at the municipal office, kid, but yeah, we can knock it out by Friday. What's the rush?" "Mike," I said, a smile creeping across my face. "How do you feel about malicious compliance, federal safety regulations, and pissing off a tyrannical HOA president?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then a deep, rumbling chuckle vibrated through the speaker. "Buddy, I've been fighting HOA boards for 20 years. You just say the word, and I'll bring the mixer." The trap was officially set. Brenda wanted to play with rules? I was about to introduce her to the manual on uniform traffic control devices and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and she wasn't going to like it one bit. By Wednesday, Big Mike's massive, diesel-chugging F250 pulled up to my curb. Mike stepped out of the truck, and the man was exactly as advertised. He was roughly 6'5", built like a brick retaining wall, and had forearms covered in faded tribal tattoos. He was wearing steel-toed boots, paint-stained jeans, and a high-vis yellow vest that looked like it was struggling to contain his massive shoulders. "You the guy with the apron problem and the HOA problem?" Mike yelled over the rumble of his truck engine, slamming the driver's side door. I walked out to meet him, handing him a cold bottle of water. "That's me. Did the city approve the right-of-way permit?" Mike took the water, cracked the plastic cap with one massive calloused hand, and downed half the bottle in 3 seconds. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and pulled a folded piece of thick, yellow municipal paper from his back pocket. "Got it right here, kid. Stamped and approved by the City of Celebration. We are officially authorized to tear up the municipal right-of-way connecting your private property to the county road. We start Friday morning at 7 a.m. sharp." "Mike," I said, grinning, "let me walk you through the safety protocol for this project." I invited him inside and laid out the blueprints on the kitchen table. But I wasn't just showing him concrete depths and rebar placement. I pulled out a 2-inch thick 3-ring binder that I had spent the last 48 hours assembling. I flipped it open to a heavily highlighted section. According to the Federal Highway Administration, I began, tapping a laminated page, and specifically outlined in the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, or MUTCD, any personnel working within the right-of-way of a public street must wear Class 3 high-visibility safety apparel. Mike leaned over the table, squinting at the dense legal text. Yeah, standard OSHA regulations. My crew and I always wear the Class 3 vests, so what? So, I said, turning the page to the OSHA mandate 1926.201, which governs signaling and spotting. The law also mandates that if a project obstructs the right-of-way, a designated safety spotter must be present to monitor oncoming traffic, and that spotter is also required by federal law to be clad in high-visibility apparel. I am formally designating myself as your safety spotter for the duration of this project. Mike looked at me, his bushy eyebrows furrowing together. Okay, so you're going to wear a vest. How does that screw over the HOA? I didn't say a word. I just stood up, walked into the hallway, and grabbed the neon yellow spandex morphsuit off the coat rack. I walked back into the kitchen and tossed it onto the table right on top of the blueprints. Mike stared at the puddle of aggressive, glowing spandex. He looked at the OSHA manual. He looked back at the suit. I could literally see the gears turning in his head. Federal law requires high-visibility apparel, I said, my voice deadpan. It specifies the minimum square inches of reflective or high-vis material required. This suit, by my calculations, provides approximately 300% more high-visibility coverage than a standard Class 3 vest. I am not wearing a novelty costume, Mike. I am wearing federally mandated maximum coverage safety gear. Big Mike's eyes went wide. His mouth opened slightly, and then a deep, rumbling laugh started in his chest, vibrating the kitchen table. He slapped his hand down on the wood so hard my coffee mug rattled. You son of a gun! You're gonna weaponize OSHA against the neighborhood watch. I'm just a guy trying to comply with federal safety mandates, Mike. Are you going to let the HOA force us to operate an unsafe, non-compliant work environment? Absolutely not, Mike wheezed, wiping a tear of pure joy from his eye. Friday morning, 7 a.m. You be out there in that glowing banana peel, and you spot that traffic, buddy. You spot it good. Friday morning arrived with the heavy, humid stillness that only Central Florida can provide. At exactly 6:55 a.m., I stepped out of my front door. I was fully encased in the neon yellow morphsuit. I had a silver metal clipboard in my hand, holding my laminated copies of the municipal permit, the MUTCD regulations, and OSHA mandate 1926.201. I walked down my driveway with the stiff, authoritative posture of a federal inspector. I positioned myself right at the edge of the property line where my driveway met the public street, the exact boundary of the municipal right-of-way. At exactly 7 a.m., the ground began to shake. Big Mike didn't just bring a truck. He brought a massive, roaring concrete mixer, a backhoe, and a crew of 3 guys all blasting classic rock from a heavy-duty job site radio. The noise was glorious. The heavy machinery clanked and hissed as they parked along the curb. Mike jumped out, wearing his high-vis vest, and gave me a crisp, entirely unironic salute. "Morning, safety spotter," he yelled over the sound of the backhoe tearing into my old, cracked concrete. "Morning, foreman," I yelled back through my mesh face shield. "Traffic is clear. Proceed with excavation." It took exactly 12 minutes for Brenda to appear. I didn't even have to look to know she was coming. I could feel the sheer, toxic radiation of her anger before she even cleared her front porch. She was practically sprinting across her impeccably manicured lawn, still wearing her sensible beige pajamas, holding a cell phone to her ear with one hand and frantically waving a rolled-up copy of the HOA bylaws in the other. "Stop! Stop this immediately!" she shrieked. Her voice was barely audible over the grinding gears of the backhoe, but her face was completely flushed, contorted in absolute rage. She marched right up to the edge of my property line, stopping just short of the right-of-way. "You!" she screamed, pointing the rolled-up bylaws directly at my neon yellow face. "I gave you a final warning. You are in direct violation of the Architectural Review Committee's emergency mandate. You are wearing a costume. You are creating a public disturbance. I am fining you $500 right now, and I am calling the police." I slowly lowered my clipboard. I looked at her through the yellow spandex. I didn't break character. I didn't raise my voice. I just stood my ground on the edge of the street. "Ma'am," I said, projecting my voice clearly over the construction noise, "you are interfering with a federally mandated safety zone. Please step back. I am actively monitoring the right-of-way." Brenda's jaw dropped. She looked at the backhoe. She looked at Big Mike, who was leaning against a shovel, grinning from ear to ear. And then she looked back at me. "You are out of your mind. Hello? Yes, 911. She yelled into her phone, turning her back to me. "I need officers at my location immediately. My neighbor has lost his mind. He is standing in the street in a fetish suit. He's exposing himself. It's indecent exposure and reckless public disturbance. Send someone now." She hung up the phone, glaring at me with a look of pure, triumphant malice. "You're going to jail," she hissed. "They are going to arrest you, and I am going to have a lien put on this house before you even make bail." I just nodded slowly. "Noted, ma'am. Traffic is still clear." 15 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the morning fog. A police cruiser came screaming around the corner, coming to a halt right behind Mike's concrete mixer. And this is exactly where our story began. The doors flew open, and out stepped Officer Ramirez, looking even more exhausted than he had a week ago. But this time, he wasn't alone. A tall, gray-haired sergeant stepped out of the passenger side, his hand resting firmly on his radio, his face set in a grim line. The sergeant took one look at the construction crew, the torn-up concrete, and Brenda, who was hyperventilating on the sidewalk. Then, his eyes locked onto me, standing dead center in the driveway, glowing like a radioactive beacon in my full-body yellow spandex. The sergeant stopped dead in his tracks. The red and blue lights washed over us. Ramirez closed his eyes and let out a long, defeated groan. "All right," the sergeant barked, his voice cutting through the construction noise. Big Mike signaled the crew to kill the engines. The street fell dead silent, save for the hum of the police cruiser. "Who called us? And what exactly is going on here?" the sergeant demanded, looking directly at me. Brenda didn't even hesitate. She lunged forward, inserting herself between me and the sergeant. "I called you. I am the president of the HOA. This man is a menace. He is intentionally violating our community guidelines, wearing a leotard to terrorize me. I demand you arrest him for indecent exposure and public disturbance. Look at him. He doesn't even have a face." The sergeant looked at me, his expression caught somewhere between complete confusion and absolute annoyance. "Sir, step forward. What are you doing in a spandex suit on a public street?" I took one step forward, planting my feet firmly in the right-of-way. I played it completely straight. "Just doing my job, officer." "And what job is that exactly?" the sergeant asked, his tone dangerously flat. Before I could answer, Big Mike stepped up, wiping wet cement off his massive hands with a rag. He walked right past Brenda, ignoring her entirely, and handed the sergeant the thick, yellow municipal permit. "He's my safety spotter, Sergeant," Mike rumbled, his Boston accent cutting through the tension. "We're doing a right-of-way apron replacement. Pulled the permits on Tuesday, approved by the city. We're breaking the curb, which means we are technically operating in the municipal roadway." The sergeant looked at the permit. He verified the stamp. He verified the address. "Okay, the permit is valid. That still doesn't explain why this man is dressed like a highlighter. This was the moment, the checkmate. I raised my metal clipboard and pulled out the laminated documents. I handed them to the sergeant. "Officer," I said, my voice calm, clear, and ringing out for the entire neighborhood to hear. According to the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, which is governed by the Federal Highway Administration, any individual operating or spotting within the right-of-way of a public street must wear Class 3 high-visibility safety apparel. I tapped the second laminated sheet. Furthermore, OSHA Mandate 1926.201 explicitly requires high-visibility coverage for designated safety spotters. The Homeowners Association recently passed an emergency mandate forcing me to wear subdued, earth-toned clothing. If I comply with the HOA, I am in direct violation of federal safety laws, creating a severe liability for Big Mike's company and endangering my own life. I paused, letting the silence hang in the humid air. I turned my faceless yellow head toward Brenda, then back to the sergeant. "Officer," I asked, "as a representative of the law, are you or the HOA asking me to break federal safety mandates? Because I am simply wearing the maximum amount of high-visibility material possible to ensure my safety while operating in a public roadway. Is complying with federal law a crime in celebration?" The sergeant stared at the laminated OSHA manual in his hand. He looked at the valid municipal permit. He looked at Big Mike, who was nodding solemnly. He looked at me, standing there in skin-tight yellow perfection. And then he looked at Brenda. Brenda was shaking. It's a loophole. He's manipulating the system. It's a visual nuisance. You have to arrest him." The sergeant slowly handed the paperwork back to me. He took a deep breath. His shoulders started to shake. I thought he was going to yell, but then a sound escaped his lips. It was a snort. The sergeant covered his mouth, but he couldn't stop it. He started laughing, a deep, booming, uncontrollable laugh that echoed off the pristine suburban houses. Officer Ramirez, realizing what was happening, turned his head away to hide the massive grin spreading across his face. "Ma'am," the sergeant said, wiping a tear from his eye and pulling out his citation book. "Federal law and municipal safety regulations supersede homeowner association aesthetic guidelines. That's the supremacy clause of the United States Constitution. This man is operating within a permitted construction zone, utilizing what is, technically speaking, extremely effective high-visibility safety gear. He hasn't broken a single law." But the guidelines," Brenda stammered, her power completely dissolving in front of her eyes. "The guidelines don't trump OSHA," the sergeant replied, his voice hardening as he started writing in his ticket book. "However, Florida Statute 365.172 strictly prohibits the misuse of the 911 emergency system. You called dispatch claiming there was a reckless public disturbance and indecent exposure. Neither of those things are true. You used police resources because you don't like his outfit." He ripped the yellow slip of paper from his book and handed it to Brenda. "That is a citation for $250 for misuse of the emergency system. If you call us out here again for a landscaping dispute, I will take you to jail. Have a pleasant morning." The sergeant turned to me, nodded respectfully at my glowing yellow form, and walked back to his cruiser. Ramirez followed, throwing Big Mike a quick thumbs up before getting into the driver's seat. The red and blue lights clicked off, and they drove away, leaving Brenda standing on the sidewalk, staring at a $250 police fine, her entire world shattered by federal bureaucracy and a spandex suit. Big Mike fired the backhoe back up. The crew went back to work. Brenda didn't say a word. She turned around, walked slowly back into her house, and shut the door. The driveway took 2 days to finish, and it looked absolutely spectacular. Flawless, brushed concrete that perfectly tied into the public street. But the real victory wasn't the curb appeal. By Monday evening, the news of Brenda's police citation had spread through the neighborhood chat groups like wildfire. The HOA board, utterly terrified of a massive lawsuit regarding the enforcement of illegal anti-federal safety policies, held an emergency closed-door meeting. They held a vote of no confidence. Brenda was immediately stripped of her title and permanently removed from the Architectural Review Committee. The subdued, earth-toned mandate was quietly erased from the bylaws the very next day. I eventually went back to wearing normal clothes for my lawn care. Usually it's just a faded t-shirt and some gym shorts, but every once in a while, when the Florida sun is shining perfectly, I'll pull out that salmon polo, just to keep them on their toes. Listen, you guys know I'm a reasonable guy. I like my peace, I like my quiet, and I like following the rules. But sometimes, when someone demands that you blend in with their miserable, beige little world, you just have to glow in the dark. If you loved watching an HOA tyrant get absolutely dismantled by the Supremacy Clause and the Federal Highway Administration, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and never ever let anyone tell you what color you're allowed to wear on your own property.